In a world consumed by power, corruption, and hidden agendas, there exists a figure whose influence spans continents, whose name strikes fear into the hearts of many. This man is so powerful that he can change the elections in the United States of America to his liking. He even put President Trump in court because of his unlimited influence. His name is George Soros, the world's most evil businessman. On the surface, this man is a likable philanthropist who wants to advance noble causes. But when you scratch the surface, and as you watch this video, you'll see that it's a very different story. Behind his image of philanthropist, savior of poor migrants, and promoter of democracy lies a man who has enriched himself by destabilizing entire nations, ruining the lives of ordinary people, and this man is secretly preparing chaos to profit from it again. To understand this man's true motivations, we need to go back to his origins. George Soros was born on August 12, 1930 in Budapest, Hungary, into a rather prosperous family of non-practicing Jewish faith. His father, Tivadar, was a lawyer, and his mother, Erzbet, owned a successful silk store on her side of the family. He didn't have an easy childhood. During his childhood, the world was on the verge of the Second World War. With a humiliated and revengeful Germany, he lived under the occupation of the Nazi regime in Hungary during the Second World War. In 1944, when he was only 14 years old, his father Tivadar decided to acquire false identity papers for himself and his family in order to avoid problems with the Nazi occupiers. So the Soros family took on new identities and lived as Christians in order to blend into society to escape the Nazi regime and the suspicion of their collaborators. This choice saved his family's life and allowed them to survive the war. These events influenced Soros' personality and worldview, instilling in him a deep desire for social justice and human rights. This is at least what Soros wants you to believe, a sad and courageous childhood. However, you will see that this childhood is used to justify aggressive and very dubious actions. Anyway, in 1947, when the communists were consolidating their power in Hungary, Soros fled to England. He worked part-time as a train porter and nightclub waiter to finance his studies at the London School of Economics. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Philosophy in 1951 and a Master of Science in Philosophy in 1954. In 1954, after earning his master, he started working in British and American merchant banks like Singer and Friedlander of London, FM Mayer, Wertham and Company, and later joined Arnold and S. Blatchroder. In 1969, Soros set up his first hedge fund, Double Eagle, and profits made from this fund provided the seed money for Soros Fund Management in 1970. Later, his first hedge fund, Double Eagle, which he founded in 1969, was renamed Quantum Fund. Now that Soros has been installed, he will carry out one of the greatest robberies in the history of finance on September 16, 1992. Speculators in Europe and especially in England will remember this day as the greatest foreign exchange collapse in history. In the early 90s, the UK was in a difficult economic situation as the recession hit and unemployment rose. Several European countries were affected, and some decided to devalue their currencies to revive their economies. At the same time, in order to stimulate its exports and limit exchange rate fluctuations, the UK decided to join the European monetary system, a common monetary regime that aims to harmonize the value of European currencies among themselves. Without much success, since 2 years later, England could not get out of the crisis and inflation exploded. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, George Soros observed the situation and came up with a diabolical plan to take advantage of the crisis and make himself richer. In the shadows, he observes the crisis into which the British economy is sinking. George Soros was convinced that the pound situation would become unsustainable and that the Chancellor of Exchequer would sooner or later be forced to devalue it. At the end of the first half of 1992, he drew up an investment strategy. It was based on a $10 billion line of credit granted to Quantum in return for a $1 billion guarantee, known as leverage. Soros also discreetly rallied other investment funds to his cause, such as Caxton Corp, Jones Investment, and major US banks like JP Morgan, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America, persuading them that the pound would soon leave the European monetary system. On September 16, 1992, a day nicknamed the Black Wednesday, Denmark voted no to the Maastricht Treaty, creating chaos on the markets. And with the pound in turmoil, George Soros seized the opportunity to go on the offensive. On the currency market, he had built up a short position of £10 billion. He understood that the UK government would be forced to lower the value of the pound due to a little pressure from the sellers. Everyone knew that the pound was overvalued, but nobody was convinced that this was the time to short the pound. Soros realized that if a word of even the smallest depreciation of the pound sterling came from high-ranking officials, traders and speculators would jump on board with him and cause the pound to devalue. Luckily for him, the good news came from Helmut Schlesinger, who said in an interview that he doesn't rule out some currencies might come under pressure. Following Schlesinger's remark, traders also began to build up a sizable short position against sterling, as they were certain that the pound had to devalue. Despite the British government's attempts to save its currency, it was too late, as it was dealing with a vicious and remorseless businessman. The UK government accepted defeat and withdrew from the European monetary system to make the market decide the exchange rate. The pound had fallen nearly 10% on Black Wednesday. The chaos of Black Wednesday will lead the UK into multiple crises. The first consequence of the Soros-induced sterling crisis was a loss of political and economic credibility for the UK and the Bank of England on the financial markets. This crisis also weakened the Conservative Party as well as the UK Prime Minister John Major and contributed to Tony Blair's victory in the next election. Moreover, the chaos cemented Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party. Ultimately, the UK lost £3.3 billion during that offensive. Nevertheless, the operation was a resounding success for the small group Soros rallied. Caxton Corp earned $300 million, the John Funds $250 million. The month that destroyed the European exchange rate mechanism was very profitable for the American banks, especially those that followed Soros in his alliance against the British pound. Citicorp, JP Morgan, Chemical Banking, Bankers Trust, Chase Manhattan, First Chicago, and Bank America. Together, in the third quarter, They brought in over $800 million more pre-tax than they normally earn in a quarter from currency trading. But the big winner was George Soros, who earned $1.5 billion in the month of September. This story not only made him a legend, but also filled his firm's coffers as assets under management jumped to $7 billion from $3.3 billion by mid-October 1992 and to $11 billion by the end of 1993. From now on, Soros will use his fortune to reshape the world according to his vision. With his Open Society Foundation, he funds movements that support his ideology. The Open Society is the world's second largest philanthropic organization with over $30 billion invested since 1984. In Europe, it funds pro-immigration movements. Most of these are NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that provide exponentially cheaper labor to European employers with the connivance of smugglers and slave traders. He claims to promote democratic and liberal values with his foundation, but in reality, his aim is quite different. He wants to destabilize European nations just as he destabilized Britain in the 90s, in order to profit from the chaos and make a fortune. How does he do it? As with the Bank of England, Soros has been quietly preparing the ground since 1984. Funding judges and bribing members of the European Parliament to pass laws favorable to his ideology. According to a report released by the European Centre for Law and Justice in February 2020, 22 of the 100 judges who presided over cases between 2009 and 2019 had a direct connection to one of the 7 George Soros founded or funded NGOs working at the European Court of Human Rights. To make things worse, the report did not include those with indirect links to the Open Society Foundation. Over this period, on 88 occasions, 18 of these 22 judges sat on a case involving the NGO they had worked for in a blatant conflict of interest. This report did not make much of a splash in the media because Soros, with its financial might and connection, was able to keep the matter quiet. Even worse, 2 months after the report was published, the European Court ignored the report and appointed the Bulgarian Yonko Grozev to the important post of section president. This man has no prior experience as a judge, and as a judge, he was seized of cases which he himself had brought to the European Court of Human Rights as a lawyer, or which has been brought by his former NGO colleagues. The European Court of Human Rights is the highest judicial body in Europe. It was designed to impose certain moral values on national political authorities. In doing so, it is not subject to any checks or oversight. It has the last word. George Soros, however, has infiltrated the organization perfectly, imposing his ideology. It's not just public institutions that are being infiltrated, but also companies. Haven't you noticed that all companies are becoming woke at the same time, in an almost too perfectly coordinated way? The reason for this is the CEI, the Corporate Equality Index, a credit score based on the extent to which a company promotes woke issues, which comes from the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. This foundation is the world's largest LGBT+ political lobby, campaigning to get its ideas across to companies. And with its influence, it has persuaded the world's biggest corporations to undergo and follow its evaluation. Businesses that attain the maximum 100 total points earn the coveted title Best Place to Work for LGBTQ Equality. 15 of the top 20 Fortune-ranked companies received 100% ratings last year in 2022. The HRC lists 5 major rating criteria, each with its own lengthy subsets for companies to gain or to lose. The main categories are workforce protections, inclusive benefits, supporting an inclusive culture, corporate social responsibility, and the last, responsible citizenship. Every year, HRC sends representatives to companies to inform them on the kind of things that must be made visible within the company. They provide them with a set of requirements, and if they don't comply, they risk losing their CEI score. Many investors and investment funds put pressure on companies with low CEI scores by refusing to finance them. The representatives sent by HRC are putting pressure on big brands to be woke. That's why you've recently seen the Nike ad, the Bud Light campaign, or even Kate Spade's collaboration with Dylan Mulvaney. By the way, the man behind HRC who runs all this is none other than George Soros. The HRC has also introduced measuring instruments for schools, municipalities, and states. If companies or schools were to refuse to participate, investment funds would shut them down and refuse to invest in them. It's important to understand that Soros isn't the only one in this game. There's also, for example, Klaus Schwab with the World Economic Forum, or Larry Fink with his company BlackRock, the biggest investment fund in the world, who also operate in a similar way as the HRC of George Soros. BlackRock uses a similar system called the ESG score to put pressure on companies for them to follow his agenda. All of these three guys together are putting pressure to create a new world order in which they'll be in charge of. A world where destroyed states will no longer have any power, where world governance will take over, where human beings will consume relentlessly, where there will no longer be any difference between peoples and cultures because they all be the same. There will be no physical difference between a Swede, a Frenchman, a Japanese, or a Nigerian. All these peoples and nations will be crushed in the globalist blender. With mass migration, differences will be erased and cultures will be standardized to obey the demands of the new masters. People will think alike and will be subject to this global governance that will impose its laws, that will supposedly save the world from the climate crisis. You won't own a car, you won't own anything, but you'll be happy, as they say. Behind the fine facade of protecting democracy, protecting the planet, and saving human rights lies a man determined to destabilize Western nations, to create nations in a perpetual state of tension by importing populations whose cultures are totally different from, or even in conflict with Western culture. As many people know, diversity is one of Soros's major preoccupations, as he wants to open Europeans to diversity so that they can get used to the change of population in Europe. In the 60s and 70s, European nations were relatively stable and homogeneous. But today, we have multicultural nations with little or no common culture. And in European capitals such as Paris, Brussels, or London, where diversity is concentrated, crime has risen sharply, and trust between citizens is crumbling. The days when you could just take the train and stroll around town without any problem are over, and this is hardly surprising given the work of Harvard professor Robert Putnam, who in 2007 published an article that seemed to call in question the benefits of living in a racially diverse society. Putnam's study, which used a large, nationally representative sample of nearly 30,000 Americans, found that people living in more diverse areas reported lower levels of trust in their neighbors. They also reported less interest in voting, volunteering, and giving to charity. In other words, greater diversity seemed to be linked to both feelings and behaviors that threatens a sense of community. The finding was alarming to many people, including Putnam himself, because the US continues to grow in racial and ethnic diversity with each passing decade. Soros' actions in the US are similar to his actions in Europe, where he funds the Democratic Party, with the aim of opening up the US to mass migration in order to change the face of the country. In 2021, Soros-backed non-profit invested at least $140 million into politically charged non-profits, just 1 year before the midterm elections. Those donations are on top of more than $170 million Soros personally contributed during the 2022 midterm election cycle to help the Democratic campaigns and political action committees. This is also the same Democratic Party that is in favor of mass migration. These population changes allow the rich and powerful to create unprecedented racial tensions and divide the people while they accumulate wealth at lightning speed. Since 2011 and the Occupy Wall Street movement, corporations have understood that if you can't beat the crowd, join them. In the US, the richest 1% are accumulating more and more wealth, while the bottom 90% are losing it. But the media won't talk about it, because people like George Soros and Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, have decided otherwise. They control the media and newspapers, and since 2011, in order to make you forget about the Occupy Wall Street movement and the growing wealth gap between the 1% and the rest of the population, they've decided to divide you with an explosion of articles on racism, on people of color, on white privilege, to separate you by skin color. They also put on TV more and more useless debates on the wage gap between men and women, even when it has been debunked thousands of times. This was crafted to separate men and women and create a war between the sexes. These are the same people who have funded Black Lives Matter and who highlights in the media the few crimes committed by police on African Americans or crimes committed by whites against African Americans. All the while, of course, avoiding any mention of the attacker's race if that person is African American, with the sole aim of enraging and mentally holding the African American community. The reality that the media don't show is that African Americans represent 30% of the population and commit around 60% of crimes. So it's not unusual for them to be more often confronted by the police. Moreover, according to FBI's 2021 data, 90% of blacks killed are killed by other blacks. But Soros and the media aren't interested in this because their aim is quite different. Elon Musk tweeted that Soros reminded him of Magneto, and in response, someone said Magneto's experiences during the Holocaust as a survivor shaped his perspective as well as his depth and empathy. Soros, also a Holocaust survivor, gets attacked non-stop for his good intentions, which some Americans think are bad merely because they disagree with these political affiliations. Elon responded by revealing Soros' true nature. You assume they are good intentions. They are not. He wants to erode the very fabric of civilization. Soros hates humanity. Soros has become so powerful that he can now take on the President of the United States, Donald Trump, without hesitation. Soros financed the New York Attorney General, Alvin Bragg, who is now relentlessly pursuing Donald Trump to punish him for favoring American interests and stopping the flow of migrants, which is contrary to Soros' intentions. Over the years, Soros has become a force to be reckoned with in Europe, dictating policy via the government of judges who would prevent European states from implementing a policy that would stop migratory flows. He is so powerful that Hungary has introduced a Stop Soros law to try to stop Soros' influence in Hungary, and the Hungarian parliament has approved a set of bills that criminalize some of the help given to illegal migrants. Soros' plan to destabilize Western nations by pushing them to change the ethnic composition of their populations seems to be working, and with Putnam's work demonstrating that trust erodes as populations become more diverse, the US and Europe are soon to face major crises and tensions. He has succeeded brilliantly. Now it remains for us to see what he intends to do with all the tension he has created in Western countries.